for checking out Firewall. I'm Matt Dean here in New York.
And I'm John David Perry from Los Angeles, and we have a very exciting episode of Firewall coming your way today.
That's right. Two of the nation's top security officials join us for a sweeping discussion on the top cyber threats plaguing our nation. So for more, we're going to bring in Governor Tom Ridge. He was the first Secretary of Homeland Security and also the co-founder of Schmidt Cyber, as well as Howard Schmidt. He also joins us from Washington today. He's a former cybersecurity advisor to Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, also a co-founder of Schmidt Cyber. Governor Ridge, based on what we've seen over the course of the last month, a host of attacks aimed at the media sector, aimed at, of course, massive breaches in the retail sector, we want to know what has changed in the cyberspace from your time as Secretary of Homeland Security until now.
Well, first of all, I think there are many dramatic changes. First of all, the attack surface has expanded. There are many more avenues of approach into the digital world. I think, frankly, the actors have changed significantly. It used to be the casual hacker, perhaps 10 or 12 years ago, but now they're organized, they're focused, they're committed towards a particular outcome, be it theft, be it sabotage, be it disruption of service. And frankly, the technological tools are a lot more sophisticated, and I think the nature of the technology has changed. And it used to be good enough just to put up some kind of perimeter defense, and we're finding that many companies that had simply a perimeter defense find themselves vulnerable because, again, the malware is far more sophisticated. They go over, under, or through the fence, and they just lie in wait inside the digital framework of these companies.
Governor Ridge, now shifting over to a legislative standpoint, what kind of laws need to be written and proposed to better protect our companies and our citizens from these kind of data thefts? And what can the current administration do to better protect us from cyber attack?
Well, first of all, I think the administration has taken some very modest but important first steps. I mean, a year ago there was an executive order that, and listen carefully, believe it or not, the executive order said that it's okay to share unclassified information. One would think you don't need an executive order to do that, but a couple months later there was another executive order where the president asked NIST, the National Institute for Standard and Technology, to develop a cyber framework dealing with critical infrastructure. The SEC has put out some guidelines for publicly traded companies to deal with the cyber threat, but at the end of the day, it's not just about government, it's about the collaboration between both the public and the private sector that will enable us to substantially reduce the threat of cyber attacks and incursions.
Now, Howard, you were a White House advisor on matters of cybersecurity, and looking at this from the perspective of these retail breaches that we've been seeing since December and just keep coming out more and more drip by drip, what would be your response to these attacks if you were still in office? And also, what would you suggest companies do to insulate themselves from breaches of this magnitude?
Well, there's a couple pieces of this. Number one, as far as the response in the White House, as the governor mentioned, that information sharing is critical. And what you oftentimes see, there's a criminal investigation going on, and oftentimes a counterintelligence investigation going on at the same time, which in effect prevents the government from sharing information beyond the victim. We've seen situations where a company has gone to the government and said, listen, we see this. Government comes in, starts the investigation. The company, whether the CEO or someone months later, calls them up and says, what's the status? And they say, sorry, we can't confirm that we are or are not conducting an investigation. So it's really critical, and particularly a big data breach like that, to help the companies with the resources that the government has, and particularly Department of Homeland Security, who has that responsibility to make sure that they indeed are, sharing that information, look at the technical aspects, not only sharing it with the company it's affected, but also the bigger sectors out there to say, here's what we're seeing, here's why we see it, and here's what you need to do about it. When you start looking at the cause of some of these things, particularly the large data breaches, what we see time and time again is exploitation of a vulnerability that many in the security industry know that exists. They write reports and say, yeah, we see this issue with the point of sale. We see this with the use of credit cards instead of pin and chip technology. And what happens, there's generally a resistance to say, that costs too much money. And we oftentimes say, you spend the money up front, you save a lot of money on the back end.
Now, Howard, we're talking about cause and effect here, but what about the consequences? In your opinion, do we have the right consequences in place to deter hackers from committing these crimes?
Well, and therein lies one of the problems. There's so many of them. As the governor said, there's so much of attack surface out there now. Everybody's using the technology. Even 5 years back, it was not being used as widely as it is now. We see great benefits from it. But when you start thinking about what happens after it, is there downstream liability? What happens when you report it? We see data breach reporting laws in 47 states, which oftentimes conflict with each other. So it's really difficult to see what the consequences are, other than for some period of time there's a lack of trust with the companies. But then that generally fades off because companies say, or customers say, yeah, I'm looked to buy something, I'm looked to buy it on sale, this is a good company, and the one data breach that we see, yeah, we'll get over that. The other thing is it's going to cost the company quite a bit of money just to reset what they're doing with the technology they've got, not even upgrading it, but just go now and say, listen, we need to issue 40 million new credit cards. And then the last piece of that is who actually absorbs that cost. Is it the retailer that one can argue maybe didn't do enough? Is it the credit card companies that say, listen, we didn't force you to do these things, we didn't make credit cards secure enough? So when you start looking at those consequences, they're still pretty much unknown as we stand today.
Now, Governor, given what we've just been speaking about, this alliance probably couldn't come at a better time. But Schmidt Cyber today is announcing a partnership with, of course, one of the big four consultant firms, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Now, explain to us what's the significance of this partnership, and what does RSC and PwC plan on doing to secure American businesses going forward?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to address it. It's not a partnership in a legal sense. It's a business alliance, because Howard and I have our own different consulting practices, and we joined together on the cyber. But this business alliance with PricewaterhouseCoopers, we think, is really unique in the marketplace today. First of all, from the Schmidt cyber piece, we think there's a strategic perspective that both Howard and I can provide based on our mutual experiences. I mean, Howard's a man that looked at cyber budgets and cyber threats in the private sector at Microsoft and eBay. He was in the White House for President Bush and President Obama as the cyber consultant, cyber czar. From my perspective, on the Hill, working as Homeland Security Secretary on a couple public boards, dealing with the energy, the retail space, risk management. And so you couple all these experiences and you've got, I think, a strategic point of view that covers the government, the regulatory framework, the public sector, technology, et cetera. If you think about it historically, I don't believe, perhaps up until recently, that anybody in the C-suite took a look at cyber risk as anything other than an IT problem, as Howard mentioned. But it's really not only a business risk, it is a business imperative. They live in the digital forevermore. The attack surface has expanded. The technology is becoming far more sophisticated. So at the end of the day, reaching out to the board of directors and to the CEO in combination with our friends at PwC, we think is a business reliance that could add great value to enterprises across the globe.
How do you intend to measure the success of this venture?
Well, there's a couple pieces. And part of the excitement is we're moving from viewing this as a complete technology issue, which has been one of the problems we have. Throw it over the transom, give it to the CIO, give it to the IT people, but not give it the CEO, the board of directors' attention it needs to be. And that's part of the things that we bring to the table and says, sitting down with the CEOs, sitting down with the board of directors and saying, this is not just a business risk, this is not just a financial risk. You really have to understand the cyber risk. Elevate those that have the responsibility to sit down with the CEOs and the board of directors on a regular basis, not just when something happens. The other thing with the partnership is how do you measure this? Well, number one, if it becomes a regular agenda item on everybody's board of directors to actually dissect it, find out what risks are out there from a cyber perspective, how they're going to build this into their business plan, how they're going to sit there and say, okay, we make sure that this is part of the budget, that we address these things on a day-to-day basis, not once a year during an audit. That's where you really see the difference get made.
Governor Tom Ridge, Howard Schmidt, co-founders of Schmidt Cyber, joining us from Washington today. Thank you so much for joining us today, guys.
Thank you again for watching Fox Firewall. We hope you enjoyed the show today. If you have any questions about the issues we discussed, or if you have ideas for future shows, please tweet us at Fox Business #Firewall.